Back on the State of the Nation today, we have Chairman of the ActionSA, and that is Michael Beaumont. Michael, welcome back for the umpteenth time to the State of the Nation. It's good to have you here.
Yeah, it's always great to be here, and flattered that I keep getting called back. So obviously I'm doing something right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're answering your phone quite quickly.
That's fair enough.
But no, you're not here just because you do make yourself accessible. You're here because you guys had your launch. ActionSA had the launch of the national campaign for 2024 general election, and that seemed to go off quite well. A lot of publicity around it.
Yeah, without any question. I think there's no doubt in the minds of the media and South Africans that ActionSA, when you conceive of how you place this party that hasn't contested at a national level yet, it is with those top 3-4 parties, and that's where people see ActionSA. And I think certainly that speaks to the level of interest. But also I think what you have there is a dynamic scenario where you've got a president of a new party. This is someone who has succeeded in life, in business, not just in politics, which is a direct contradiction with all the other presidents in those top 4, so to speak. And certainly a very clear alternative vision for South Africa. And I think so much of our body politic is spent with people saying what we already know.
Yes.
Load shedding's a problem, crime's a problem, unemployment's a problem. Everyone knows this. But I think what was quite unique about that presentation from Herman was that it was a clear vision for South Africa.
Yeah. Now, obviously, the optics are important, and it was probably clever politicking. The launch happened in Hamanskraal. Quite a good venue for a number of reasons. One, it is where Herman comes from, and it's also been an area that I think is a poster child for neglect on a national, provincial, and local level.
Without any question, I think the symbolism of being there was so important on a number of levels. It's Beaumont, a small village just outside of Hamanskraal, where Herman grew up. The actual venue was a few hundred meters from where Herman grew up. It was then a tin shack he grew up in. He grew up in a child-headed household raised by his sisters, while his mother was a domestic worker in Johannesburg, and his father had passed away at the age of 2. So a childhood that, I think many South Africans can identify with. But of course, Herman's remarkable story is, that he overcame those terrible odds and, the oppressive weight of the apartheid government in the 1980s to build a business empire. And, a big part of the messaging behind that speech was that Herman recognizes his story as the exception, but it doesn't need to be, it can be the rule. And being there and telling that story to South Africans to say, I've entered politics to make sure that more South Africans, particularly young black South Africans, can undergo the same journey that I did. And I think that message was massively powerful. But as you say, it's also a community which is, a blight on a coalition government in the city of Tshwane. And from an ActionSA standpoint, it's very important for us to talk about the challenges we've had in coalition, because coalitions are so often just focused on in terms of their instability. But, certainly from a coalition standpoint, we've had to fight tooth and nail for the people of Hamanskraal. And it's crazy in a coalition that you have to fight for something that really should just be accommodated as part of the agenda. But certainly it's a community we fought very hard for and continue to fight for.
Now, certainly if one looks at ActionSA, it is, as we sit right now, it's quite an odd organization because, and I say this with respect, because the one thing that is a hallmark of ActionSA, and I've interviewed many of these newer parties, Rise Mzansi, Build One South Africa, Shaluva. I've had these guys in here, but it seems that hands down, ActionSA has built the most structures.
Yeah.
Right. There's been an enormous amount of organization, and I'd imagine funding, that has gone into creating a big boy apparatus.
Yeah,
is possibly the only way to say it. I mean, it does seem to me that by comparison, sure, the ANC and the DA, who have been around for a long time, have got very big structures by now, and that is probably as a result of their longevity, but also their particular sort of standing in and funding that they get through the normal structures of the state. But you guys have built structures in every province. You've got a complete system. This isn't one man and a fax machine, is it?
No, most certainly not. And look, I'll never miss the opportunity to have a good moan about the state funding that our competitors receive, their share of 1.3 billion rand. New parties like ActionSA have to raise every cent ourselves. And certainly that is a challenge. But we focus on building structures because the reality that we know, and we have a lot of people in our party who've been involved in political campaigns for a long time, is that, we don't have a Western style kind of access to data, affordable data, smartphones, etc., where in a lot of the Western world you can spend 80 or 90% of your campaign energy and resources on social media. In South Africa, the reality is most votes are won on street corners and on doorsteps. Even conversations like this, it's speaking to a minority, even throughout the media environment, because most South African people receive their news on their doorstep. So our focus has been on building structures. We knew that when we came out of 2021, however successful we had been, the goal had to be in 9 provinces and to be on the ground across the country. And certainly that has been the focus. We've had a strong team of provincial chairpersons appointed. I think you've interviewed a number of them already. People like Athol Trollop, Zwakele Mwango, Kwena Mangope. These are people with powerful followings in their regions.
And what seems to be almost unique to ActionSA is that these leaders of those structures have actually got real power. They've got real jobs. I mean, sometimes you wonder whether any of our current provincial heads has power to even run their own provinces. In your case, you've given that power to those leaders, haven't you?
Well, we have, but I think this is the remarkable thing about ActionSA that sets us apart, is that Herman Mashaba is not someone who aspires to be a career politician. He doesn't have the insecurities that most political leaders who haven't achieved something else in life have. He is very comfortable to say, I need the strongest people around me, and I'm not threatened by having those kind of people. So we have terrific leadership, but I think very importantly, that leadership has translated into the building of structures. We are literally in all 52 districts of the country, all 8 metros, and now in 35% of the wards of South Africa, which is obviously a very tough geographical terrain. But that puts you squarely in the league of the so-called big boys.
Yeah, in a way, I would say as an observer that the one thing that the structures do, and I'd imagine it's not by accident, is it starts building a pipeline for ActionSA of a pipeline of leadership, which is the Achilles heel of the ANC, there is no doubt. The EFF is just purely a pet project of Julius Malema, and it's hard to see anybody ever assuming control there. You guys have chosen a different route.
Without any question. So, I mean, certainly a pipeline in terms of leadership. But I think very importantly, it's also a pipeline of our message to the South African people. Because while we will obviously be delivering our message on posters and in radio ads and all sorts of things throughout this election, we also need to have teams of volunteers on the ground who can take that message and go and deliver it in the right language on the doorsteps of the South African people as widely as possible. I think that is the critical dynamic that we've spent the last 18 months to 2 years investing in.
Okay, so we had Herman here, and we're going to get the camera on this. When you had your policy conference, which was in September, you laid out ActionSA's policies, which is very easy to read, and very, very, very progressive. We use the word progressive incorrectly in South Africa. Progressive, dear watcher, listener, is when you give people real power. Progressive isn't when you say the state will decide everything for you from cradle to grave. That's the opposite of progressive. We use that term completely incorrectly. I'm sure you're nodding in approval. So
definitely.
Right now, this came out in September. This is your guiding light. What else? What new emerged from your launch of your 2024 campaign? What did something new come out of it, or is it just reinforcement of those policies?
I think certainly reinforcement of those policies, but of course, things happen in between a policy conference and a launch, and it allows us to speak very practically to what it is that we need to be doing as a party to provide an alternative to the South African people. But certainly the message from the launch was very clear that number one on the agenda is the economy and jobs. From that standpoint, ActionSA has laid down a number of very important markers in terms of how we believe that needs to be addressed, focusing on serious reforms for small businesses and the cutting of red tape, talking about the need to change the financial system of our country in as much as resolving the deficits that grow every year and the financial uncertainty that creates in the market, to address the labor laws of our country that make it so very difficult to employ more people, but of course to recognize that what businesses want more than anything from the state right now is policy certainty and the provision of services. The state needs to play the role of establishing the playing field in which the economy operates, but then allowing the private sector to do what the private sector does within that framework and within those rules.
Because, you know, I keep on feeling the need to emphasize this. Every cent of tax collected in this country is generated by the private sector. So people in the public sector may, in fact, pay income tax, but the source of the tax was somebody had a smart idea saying, hey, let's sell microphones. Let's make microphones and sell them at a profit. That generates and then there's a whole knock-on, and sometimes it feels like certainly we understand quite clearly that the ANC and the EFF don't get that.
Without any question, and I think you can look at a number of countries around the world for examples where the private sector has been demonized and ultimately reduced down to very little role in the economy. And you can see what's happened in those countries. It's very clear to see. And I think a big part of that, if I can, dive back into the policy kind of messaging, is, the rule of law. You don't have countries in the world which are successful unless you have a strong rule of law. And I think in many ways businesses are having to compensate for these failures. And it's as simple as the fact that when people commit a crime, someone must go to jail. It's about fixing our criminal justice system so that justice is delivered promptly. It's about getting our policemen and women doing what they need to be doing. I think in so many ways we have good policemen and women in this country who've been failed by the politically appointed leadership and foisted into the police force. And ensuring that justice is delivered through a court system that's working. We speak very strongly about the need to manage our borders. Our borders are a big part of the criminal justice problem in South Africa. You can't have a rule of law if you do not determine who and what products are entering your country and under what circumstances. Our infrastructure very clearly is a big part of the problem. If you look at what's going on right now with the port in Durban and the railways, these are big parts of the problem. And I think what's critical from our standpoint is that we are delivering solutions to these things. And I think, just one last one that we feel very strongly about as well, is ActionSA now has laid down the first alternative. We believe it's the first alternative to BEE. And that is what we call inclusive economic empowerment, IEE. And it's not that we're playing with letters. We believe very seriously that the goals of empowering people who have been disadvantaged in the past are important. But the act itself that was passed, the BEE Act, has fundamentally failed, and the evidence of that is everywhere around us. From our standpoint, we offer a number of alternatives in that regard. Interestingly, included in which is what we call the Opportunity Fund. The idea that you could actually have businesses take the 6% of profit that they are roughly spending now on BEE compliance and have that put into a privately managed fund that is politically dispersed to generate opportunities at a grassroots level, particularly around education and skills development and access to affordable financing for small businesses. That would be creating opportunity at a grassroots level in a way that BEE has never been able to do.
Now, a lot of your messaging, when one hears it, it almost sounds like it's, closer aligned to the messages of some of your coalition partners. And the ANC have been very, very good at saying that everything you're saying, ActionSA, not you, ActionSA is saying, blacks don't want. Blacks want, according to the ANC, blacks want the handout. They want the government to do everything for them, etc., etc. Your message is almost allowing for civil liberties at a personal level. Now, the point that I'm getting to in a long-winded way is that generally the policies that you espouse, one would imagine, if one took the message completely from the ANC playbook, will not be popular with black people in South Africa. What's been your finding?
Well, I think quite far from it, because firstly, I always rail against this idea of talking about policies at the level of, where there's overlap and where there's disagreement, certainly as it relates to the ANC. because at a policy level, the ANC is against corruption. If you read their policies, they're against corruption. And yet, if you look at what they do in real life, it's so fundamentally opposite to that idea. So I think, firstly, there's always that distinction that we need to draw. But I think actually the reality is more and more a younger set of generations are emerging in South Africa that are growing restless. And they're going restless about the idea that all you can aspire to is your 350 Rand a month. I think people want to be able to work. People want the dignity of work. They've grown up in households where parents haven't worked and where the social fabric of our society is really suffering from substance abuse, drug addictions, and the various other challenges that we know are a dynamic when you don't have parents that have the dignity of work, who are able to provide for their children. And I think there's a younger set of generations that are emerging in South Africa saying we want better and we want more. And what we're finding certainly is that while our message, isn't likely to sway a 70-year-old in the rural Eastern Cape who's voted ANC their entire life, and we acknowledge that certainly not every voter is going to be within reach of your message. What we are seeing is that a huge majority of a younger generation under the age of 50 or 40 in these various places is receiving that message. They are highly inspired by Herman's personal story and his backstory. And they are saying that what ActionSA is putting on the table is hugely compelling. And if you want evidence of that, I always find this an interesting figure, is that the average age of a member of ActionSA is 37 years old. And that's an interesting dynamic when you consider what the age of other political parties, the average age of a member would be.
Now, the average age being 37, I'm sort of taken by the idea that, we've had a country that for 15 years has not seen economic growth. And those 37-year-olds in their professional lives have never seen economic growth. Do they even recognize the power of the economic growth, in your opinion? I mean, do they understand what the turbocharge of economic growth looks like?
It's probably a bit of a challenge to talk about that group as a kind of homogenous group who probably see things or understand things the same way. I think there's always an extent to which people underestimate how tuned in that demographic is in South Africa politically and economically. But certainly, I think you've got to be real that, you've got to take economic growth and you need to break it down to the level that resonates with a particular person. Now, there is a economist who, you got to talk to in a very specific kind of way, but you got to recognize that, a very, very small minority of South Africa are going to be dealing with things on the level of macroeconomic fiscal policies, expansionist fiscal policies, and that kind of thing. Whereas in real terms, what we need to be able to do is break down this discussion about our economy to the level of the person in the street and adapt that conversation to what the person in the street may be experiencing, because a huge proportion of that group of people are operating, whether it's in the informal or formal economies, and they are experiencing the pinch of high fuel prices, the increasing cost of living, how expensive borrowing money is. And these are important things that we can be able to communicate. But at the same time, we've also got to be able to talk to people who don't yet have the foot in the door of the economy, who haven't had that opportunity to climb up the first rung of the ladder, so to speak, and to be able to talk about how they can undergo that journey from an ActionSA standpoint.
When speaking to ActionSA, one of the difficulties as we sit here now towards the end of 2023 is to try and understand what kind of support ActionSA has. And that's fairly logical, and purely because you have not contested a general election. You contested a very small part of the local government election by standing in 6 municipalities. And it means that the analysts and poll takers out there seem to have no idea where to place you guys.
Without any question. And we're seeing that every day. In fact, I published a piece in City Press over the weekend, which I don't think scored me too many friends in the political kind of market. But what we're basically saying is that we've got to learn to take polling with a pinch of salt in this country. And I'll circle back to that in a moment. But from an ActionSA standpoint, contested the 6 municipalities in 2021 out of 278 and came 6th in the country with 2.4%. And I think certainly a lot of positives we take from that. But, you don't carry your last result into the next election. You've got to build on it. Certainly the job has been to expand and to be in all 9 provinces and on the ground in the ways that you and I have been talking about. But we are poised to deliver what we believe to be a very strong result in this election. If you look at the history of new parties in South Africa, the best a first-time party's ever done was COPE, which I think was at around 7.8% or something of that nature. Second was the EFF at 6 point something. And certainly we see ourselves beating both of those parties quite significantly. And I think importantly as well, in a world where provincial dynamics are starting to become very relevant in terms of changing power, we see ourselves as the biggest party in a coalition here in Gauteng, because we believe we need to show South Africans a third way. They've seen the ANC way, they've seen the DA way, particularly here in Gauteng, and I think there's a need to show a third way in terms of how stable coalitions can be run. But, certainly people battle to measure ActionSA. The polls don't know how to place us, and that's largely because when a poll is engaging a potential voter, there is firstly the reality that, while voters have made their minds up about the top 3 parties years ago, there's many people who are going to vote for ActionSA next year that haven't heard of us today. They're going to engage us and be engaged by us in the coming weeks and months. And what we're seeing is we're converting a huge number of those people we're engaging. So we're in a race against time in terms of name recognition and favorability, and we know that. But also what you're seeing in polling in South Africa is a global trend where polling is becoming less and less reliable. If you talk about Hillary Clinton, if you talk about the Australian election in 2019, if you talk about Brexit, these are very public examples where pollsters got it fundamentally wrong. And I think we're seeing it more and more because as South Africans are becoming more and more disillusioned about the political system, their willingness to comment on whether they're going to vote and who they're going to vote for now, and whether that comment remains true 5 months from now, is a much more rapidly changing and volatile environment than it was, let's say, 5-6 years ago.
You mentioned the word coalitions. ActionSA was an enthusiastic party in the multi-party charter and the discussions that took place at Empress Palace leading to the multi-party charter, the agreement between parties. And then it seemed that promptly everybody went back to war after that charter, if one looks at some of the things that played out at the local level. First things first, I understand that there is a difference between the multi-party charter talks, which was more around national and provincial issues, but not only, and the reality on the ground. Firstly, are you happy with the way that the multi-party charter, the shape that it's taken, the participation by the various groupings? Are you happy with that process?
So let me just say, firstly, our enthusiasm for this project is not about other political parties. We never entered into this for other political parties. We entered into it for the South African people. And from that point of view, we remain enthusiastic because the reality is the 2024 election will be a referendum on change. If people would like to see the status quo continue or accelerate, the ANC and EFF very clearly represent that pathway for South Africa. And if they want to see change in their country, our conglomerate of political parties has come together saying we represent change, and in the most credible and powerful way. And we remain enthusiastic about that project, irrespective of individual parties and how they conduct themselves. But certainly it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how we feel about the charter at this stage in terms of the events that you've described. I think let's start with the positive. What is really exciting to see in the charter is that the parties are coming together. They're doing a lot of work behind the scenes, which isn't always visible. But we're currently looking at our policy solutions to the biggest challenges in South Africa: the economy, ending load shedding, fighting crime, education, infrastructure, etc. And we are sitting down and say, what is the overlap between these policies, so that we can go out in the new year, in the run-up to the election, and jointly present those solutions to the South African people. Because no matter how much there may be bickering on the side or things that are noise and white noise to voters. I think what people want to see is that we can sit down, we can put differences aside and say, this is how we will end load shedding. This is how we'll grow the economy. This is how we'll fight crime. And that's what we're working to package in the new year. And I think that's great, because that should be 90% of the conversation, not the other stuff. But I regret the other stuff continues to dominate the conversation a bit. And since we last spoke, you and I continue to live in a municipality that is governed by the ANC and EFF, what the DA calls the doomsday scenario, the very scenario that we are coming together nationally and provincially to avoid. And yet for the fourth time in 2023, the DA has collapsed talks that were designed to remove the doomsday coalition in Joburg. The evidence of their destruction is visible everywhere, just outside on the streets outside. We see it. And yet the DA's passed on that opportunity, saying it won't be stable enough. Now, it's true. I mean, there's no doubt 2021 served up coalition numbers that are difficult. They're tenuous. But what are we saying to the people of Joburg if the numbers are too complex? We're not going to try. We're not going to provide leadership to the people of Johannesburg if it's not convenient or well suited for us to do so. And then we're going to hold on and wait for a 2 or 3 party coalition that has a 2/3 majority like you have in Germany. Now, that's not realistic in a South African standpoint. We've got to be pragmatic. We've got to come together. And we might have to do what is the least worst when it comes to building coalitions and even working with parties like the PA that is true, have proven to be untrustworthy in those particular regards. But is it best that the PA continues to govern in a coalition with the ANC and EFF? Well, I don't think any Joburg resident suggests that's a good idea. And I think from our standpoint, our very public view on this issue is you've got to build confidence in change in the run-up to 2024, provincially and nationally. Joburg constitutes probably about 50% of the population of Gauteng. So if we're going to say to the people of Joburg, sorry, it wasn't good timing, how are we going to say to them in 2024 from a Gauteng provincial standpoint and even a national standpoint that we're serious about delivering change? And I think that's where there's a widely divergent view between us and the DA. But ultimately, when you have divergent views, the best thing to do, rather than to leave or collapse the charter, which we have no intention of doing, is say, all right, these two parties feel differently. People of Johannesburg, people of Gauteng, people of South Africa, when you vote in 2024, you should seriously consider this dynamic in terms of how you vote. Because here's a party that says we're only going to enter coalitions when the numbers are nice and tidy and easy and stable, which is well and good if the numbers are that way. But if you as a voter think that might not be the case, then maybe you need to think about casting your vote for a political party that is willing to provide leadership for you as a voter, even if it is not convenient or easy to do so.
Because ultimately what is going to grow the coalition is going to be genuine acts of leadership when areas are run properly. And to that extent, we had a very deep conversation with Solly Msimanga on this platform to try and make sense of that decision to not at least get that foot in the door, which they could have. With the sort of axing of the speaker and in the city of Johannesburg, because this is a bellwether, this is a litmus test, this is all of the above.
It's the economic hub of our country.
Yeah, well, it was.
Well, it could still be.
Could, yeah. So there's obviously rough terrain to go, but the story I'm getting, and you seem to back it up, is that the multi-party charter is in a good place. Looking at those bigger pictures, but at ground level, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Look, I mean, yeah, that would be the way we want people to see it. The truth is that perhaps, you may be a bit more progressive than most people in the fact that you can ring fence what's going on at the multi-party charter level separately from what's happening in Joburg. From an ActionSA standpoint, we fundamentally believe that South Africans don't make that distinction. They see government, they see problems, they see change not being delivered, and they're seeing political actors who can't get their act together to make it happen. And I think from that point of view, most people don't draw that neat line under local government, say, well, that's local government. And that's what we've been saying to the DA in this charter, to say this is impacting the confidence in the provincial and the national project. And I'm glad you said you had Solly here. I'll definitely go and look for that video. I'm surprised you used the word deep in that conversation, because it must have been like a cat on a hot tin roof. How do you explain to the people of Joburg that our goal is to keep the ANC and EFF out in 2024, provincially and nationally, but gosh, sorry, it's just not easy enough for us to do it at a local level, so you're stuck with them.
Yeah, look, I mean, I made the point, and I'll do it again, is that one questions the stomach for the fight in the DA when it comes to the areas here in the hot ones in Johannesburg, and are they not just happy to keep the Western Cape and keep it all tidy and build a wall? And it's starting to look like that seems to be part of the policy.
Well, I think if Joburg was in the Western Cape, you would have seen a bit more fight, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But it appears Joburg isn't top of the agenda. But let me just put this to you. So imagine you're a DA voter, and you've voted for this party, and you've given them 71 councillors in the city of Johannesburg in the last election. Presumably you've done so despite issues that you may have. And their only idea right now for the people of Johannesburg in terms of what they should do with those 71 councillors is that they must dissolve the council. You'd have to ask yourself as a voter if your vote has not been wasted, most fundamentally. And as evidence of that, let me offer you the following. When the DA went and brought this motion to dissolve the Joburg Council last week, they couldn't even get all of their councillors to vote for it. Out of 71, they got 60 DA councillors to vote for that motion. Well, and it just shows to demonstrate that there's an agenda being driven nationally, right over the heads of the people locally who live in the city, care about the city, and probably want to fight for it.
If you once you get watching and you watch the interview that I did with Solly Msimanga, you should watch the one that I did with Helen Ziller about a month ago, in which I put it to her that the idea of dissolving the council is an absurdity. And it doesn't, it seems like one of those excuses one gives when you don't really want to conclude the issue. You just put the objective so far out of reach.
Well, to show you how serious it was, Mike, and I think let's move on to anything else after this, quite frankly. It's too much on the DA in life. But let's put it this way. You need a 2/3 majority to dissolve a municipal council by law. The DA did not even canvass the support of its former coalition partners before it went in there. It just shows you that the intention wasn't really to dissolve council. It was to deflect from the obvious point that their refusal to vote for motions of no confidence to remove the ANC and EFF, is effectively, meaning that we continue under such a government at their behest.
Let's not get too gloomy, because next year this time we could be the Republic of South Africa led by President Roger Jardine. Right?
Yeah.
There's been a media blitz. Obviously, somebody is touting this as a solution. Once again, that seems about as likely as dissolving the Johannesburg Council. What say ye?
No, I think it's actually less likely. The Johannesburg Council dissolution actually got 63 votes at the end of the day. I think from our point of view, it was astonishing. As partners in the multi-party charter, we woke up on Sunday morning, none the wiser, opened up the Sunday Times like the leaders of the IFP and Freedom Front and ACDP and everyone else would have done. And here we see that there are discussions between the DA and Roger Jardine about his possible leadership of their party, which is their business. They decide who leads their party. But they're also to lead the multi-party charter as a presidential candidate. And we go, goodness, how do you have that kind of a conversation without all the other parties in the charter? Because quite frankly, all of the parties in the charter have adopted a view of saying, we don't want to talk about a presidential candidate now. We actually want to focus on all of our parties campaigning behind our own leaders, our own solutions, and winning as many votes as we possibly can for the collective good of the charter and the change project in South Africa. And you can't possibly have a scenario where we've got a party like ActionSA, we're 3 years old, we're fighting to build name recognition. And you must say, we must now campaign behind Roger Jardine. We need to campaign behind Herman Mashaba. And we need to tell that story as much as we can, because that will win the most ANC votes for the collective benefit of the multi-party charter. But also, I think there's also the absurdity that, along with the story goes a so-called commitment of R1 billion in financing for the multi-party charter. I think we've experienced very recently in South Africa the problems of having political leadership associated with money and offers of money. The State Capture Commission of Inquiry has ventilated that issue pretty strongly. But quite frankly, if you were going to hold a gun to my head and say, is Roger Jardine the political answer to the challenges the Charter has of receiving a majority in 2024? I don't think so. I mean, I may not be the most clued up person in business, but I mean, I certainly had heard the name, but had to Google the specifics. And if you're talking about a candidate who's going to go out there and really move and shake on the ground and generate a majority that the Charter may not yet have, that's not the name that's going to go and do it.
Well, Michael Beaumont, clearly the work that you have done, heading up the team, and that the team have done, ActionSA does have a formidable structure. Congratulations to that. That should help people. It should dispel the idea that a vote for ActionSA is a wasted vote. That we hear that term a lot. And there are wasted votes out there. And I do want to speak to people that are watching this. There are wasted votes in voting for parties that will sell their votes. You're not wasting a vote when you've got a party with legitimate structures. We may not like those structures, even in some of the coalition partners. We may not like that, but at least there's structures, and people hear it's not just at the whims of one person. We do have a couple of parties at the whims of one person. That is dangerous, and the smaller they are, the more dangerous it gets. So, there is such a thing as a wasted vote. In fact, there's a thing called a dangerous vote, and that is when you vote for some of these entrepreneurial parties. So please, let's not do that. But Michael Beaumont, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation again. We will continue to monitor the progress of ActionSA. Best of luck. And we'll see you again soon on the State of the Nation. Thank you all for joining us today.